Introducing Rabbi Joel Zeff at 10 o'clock sharp on a Wednesday morning as he zip along with Zoom with the Friday Shkolel. Rabbi Zeff will take us on a exciting shear. And why don't you announce that topic, Rabbi Zeff, and tell us
Yeah.
where we're going with
So
it.
today we're
Moshe's
going.
face shining.
Yeah. So today we're going to be beginning an analysis that involves a kind of classic delving into Parshanut, the classical analysis of verses in the Torah. And we're going to take a look at one of the most intriguing and perplexing passages in the Torah. It happens to be in last week's Torah portion. That's why I was thinking about it. And of course, you may be watching this recording at any other time, so it may not be last week's Torah portion. But so it's in the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus. And that is a description of Moshe coming down from Mount Sinai. And he has apparently some kind of glow or something coming out of his face. And he has to put on a veil to cover it up, etc. It's all shrouded in mystery. And we're going to dive into it and to try to understand that passage. It has very interesting implications in terms of art history for those of you who are interested in that kind of thing, and a fascinating analysis of the subtle meanings of Hebrew words. How do we determine what a Hebrew word means? Not so simple. In addition to taking a look at how Midrash expands and expounds upon these ideas in the Torah, etc. So it's going to be hopefully very exciting. And though the texts were distributed, I think we'll do a screen share just in case here. So let's just handle that
I,
now. Yeah.
I did send it out. Everyone
Yeah.
should have it.
Okay. Excellent. I think it's probably still a good idea to do a screen share. So let's see your screen share. And okay. Everybody see that screen share there? Okay. Right. It got pulled up. You want to just shake your head? Yes, no? Everybody can see it? Okay, great. Okay.
When
Let's just, yeah, I'm
you made
sorry.
a reference earlier, you made a reference when you gave the introduction, something about Agadic or Midrashic comments. For the Torah's perspective, I guess there's halacha and then there's non-halachic stories. But would you characterize the Torah as agadic or midrashic as opposed to kind of like a pshat, like the storyline, so to speak?
Yeah, okay. Bruce, you have reached new heights. I haven't even started this year. So I'll just say, and without going into discussion about it, that when we say halacha nagada, they're technical terms that are referring to rabbinic literature, so Talmudic literature. So if it's of legal content or non-legal content, though it's certainly true that in the Torah itself, there are passages that are, we could call them perhaps narrative passages, and there are passages which are of legal content. So that distinction in kind certainly exists in the Torah itself, but those specific terms we don't usually use in reference to the Torah itself. Fine. Okay, so let's take a look at how the Torah describes this incident. And I have all the text here in both Hebrew and in English. And it says the following. I'm also going to read it in Hebrew. You can follow along as I'm reading it. You can look in English. Vayhi Bored Moshe mehar Sinai. And it was in the going down of Moshe from Har Sinai, Ushnei Luchot Ha'idut Yad Moshe, Burito Minahar. And the two tablets of testimony were in the hands of Moshe in his going down from the mountain. Umoshe lo yada ki karan or panav b'dabro ito. And Moshe didn't know that. Now here's the expression, ki karan or panav. So we're just going to translate it for now the way it's translated commonly and the way it's translated here in the English. He didn't know that the skin of his face shone. Ki karan or panav. Karan is translated as to show or radiate, and or panav, the skin of his face, b'dabro ito, in his speaking to him. So somehow when Moshe and God were interacting there up on Mount Sinai in the rarefied oxygen of Mount Everest, Mount Sinai. So for some reason, that his face was shining, and Moshe didn't know about it. Didn't have a mirror. Vayar Aharon v'chol bnei Yisrael et Moshe. So Aaron and all the bnei Yisrael, all the children of Israel, saw Moshe. Right, he's coming down off the mountain. V'hinei karan or panav, and behold, the skin of his face is shining, glowing, radiating. Right, that's how it's commonly translated. See, it's not so simple. Vayiru migeshet elav, and they were afraid to approach him. Scary guy, glowing in the dark. Vayikra alehem Moshe, and Moshe called to them. What's going on? Why are you running away from me? Vayashuva elav Aaron v'chol hanisim va'edav, and Aaron and all of the leaders of the congregation returned to Moshe. Vaydaber Moshe alehem, and Moshe spoke to them. V'achreichen nikshu kol bnei Israel, and then all bnei Israel came to him. So they sort of, this is commonly understood as he's teaching them Torah that he had learned on Mount Sinai. So he first taught Aaron and the leaders, and then he teaches all Bnei Israel, right, the common folk who approach him. And he commanded them all that the Lord had spoken to him at Har Sinai. And Moshe ceased speaking to them. Now another interesting development. Vayitein al panav masveh. And then Moshe puts on his face some kind of covering. We'll talk a little bit later about that Hebrew word masveh. Veil, covering. Islamic women in Saudi Arabia, what do they call it? A burqa? Maybe it was something like that. There's the eye showing, who knows? He covered up his face after he's finished speaking to the Bnei Israel. Now the Torah has ceased describing that specific incident and now makes a general comment. And when Moshe would come, right, ongoing, when Moshe would come before the Lord to speak to him, Yasir Tabasfeh, he would take off the veil. So apparently he wore it continuously, but when he would go back to speak to God, he would remove the veil. Ad Seito, until his leaving. V'yatza, and he would leave. The Diber B'nai Israel, et Asher Yitzuveh, and then he would communicate to the B'nai Israel that which he was commanded. So when he received the communication from God, he had the veil removed, or whatever it was, his face covering, and then he would come out, and he would give over the revelation that he'd received, and the last verse, Ra'u, B'nai Israel, Pnei Moshe, Kikran, or Pnei Moshe, and the B'nai Israel would see the face of Moshe, that the skin of his face radiated, shone, whatever it is, Ve'shi Moshe Tamasveh, and then he would put back on the veil. This is an ongoing type of activity, al panav, over his face.
No question to ask.
He's coming, hang on a second, until his coming to speak to him. Yes. Sorry, someone said something?
Okay, yeah. When he put the mask on, why would he put the mask on? He showed the radiance from God, so why would he put a mask on? People should see him.
I'm so glad you asked that question. We're going to answer it. It's part of the shiur. Thank you for answering that. Okay, so I want to first take a look at the word Karen or karan here. It's a verb in our text. What does that mean? And we're going to take a look at probably by far the most famous association with this notion that the skin of Moshe's face, karan, this word Karen, and what does that mean? And of course, I'm referring to the famous statue of Moses by Michelangelo. So just to remind everybody, Michelangelo, one of the most famous sculptors of all time, he lived in Italy, 1475 to 1564. And famously or infamously, if you look carefully at the head of Moses here, we see that there are two horns protruding from his head. And this obviously is based upon our verse, that when Moshe came down from the mountain, that it says that Karan or Panav, that the skin of his face, Karan, the word Karen. Now, what does that word Karen mean? Well, the common explanation of that word is, and we'll take a look at a typical verse using that word Karen. So if you take a look at source 3, we'll go back to the statue in a second. So this is a pasuk in the book of Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy. Bechor shoro hadarlo v'karnei re'em karnav. So before Moshe dies, he blesses all of his children. And in this particular blessing here, so which is given to Yosef, to Joseph. So the Torah uses the word the karnei re'em, right? The firstborn of his herd, majesty is his. His horns are the horns of the wild ox. Karnei re'em, karnav. The horns of a wild ox, karnei re'em, karnav, are his horns. And what does he do with his horns? With them he shall push all of the peoples. How about pushing? How about goring them? Would be a little bit better translation as far as horns are concerned. This is what the word Karen means in all of Tanakh, or typically in Tanakh, let's say. It means a horn, a horn. Now, this has a tremendous history, and books have been written on this based upon this notion that Moshe came down from the mountain with horns, because that's what the word commonly means. Karen is a horn of an animal. Therefore, we have not only the statue, but there's a tremendous anti-Semitic literature which portrays Jews as having horns, the precedent of Moses. And there, the association is not so much that Jews are a wild ox, but the notion of a kind of satanic notion or demonic notion of Jews being satanic, that Satan having horns. Okay, so this is a very, very loaded
Rabbi,
issue. Yes.
were these Christian interpreters unaware of the way we interpreted the word?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Okay, so you're going to see right now. So the first issue is, where the heck did Michelangelo get this notion to portray Moses with the horns on his head? Well, he got it from the Bible. Now, we have to appreciate that the Bible, right, the Christians used a Bible that had the so-called Old Testament and the so-called New Testament, right, in one volume. And it was not the Hebrew version, obviously, of the Torah, right, Tanakh, but it was the Vulgate, the Vulgate. Now, what is the Vulgate? The Vulgate is a Latin translation of the Tanakh, which was written by Jerome, who was a Croatian priest in the 4th century, Croatia.
It wasn't from the Septuagint? He took it right from the Hebrew?
He took it from the Hebrew. Really interesting. He knew Hebrew. Jerome knew Hebrew. Okay? There's debate. Some people say his Hebrew wasn't so great, but he knew Hebrew. Okay? So that's the Vulgate. Now, by the way, interestingly enough, it's called Vulgate from the same Latin word as vulgar. You know, vulgar in Latin doesn't necessarily mean what it means nowadays. You know, now it has sort of the sense of obscene. Vulgar actually means common. Common. So it's called the Vulgate because it was the common translation of the Tanakh. Okay, Vulgate, Jerome, the 4th century. Now, if you take a look here, I actually, for your Latin pleasure, I have here the Latin translation of our particular verse here, and I have an English translation of the Latin. So if you take a look at the part that's significant, right? And when Moses came down from the mountain, he held the 2 tablets of the testimony, and he knew not that his face was horned. Face was horned. Now, if you take
Latin, the Latin actually uses the word corona.
yeah, so I actually have it here, cornuta.
Yeah, corona.
Yes. I didn't appreciate it the first time you said it. It is the same word. It's the same word, corona. So the Latin particular, thank you, is cornuta. That's the Latin word used here. Now, this is also just a footnote. And I did some research on this, and nobody seems to have a particularly convincing explanation. So corona, or cornuta, which is a specific Latin form here, that sounds a heck of a lot like the Hebrew word Karen. Corona, cornuta, it's the same consonantal sounds. And it happens to be the Latin translation of the word Charan. Now, how you have a Latin word and a Hebrew word, which are essentially identical in terms of their consonants, no one knows exactly how that happened in terms of the etymology of the word, but it is a fascinating thing to observe. Yes.
Interesting thing. The word Karen in Latin can, as well as Hebrew, not only means horns, but beam, a beam of light.
Right.
Interesting. So I took Latin when I was young, but it's been a while. So I actually appreciate it if you could send me something that the word that root can mean a beam in Latin, because the common understanding is that it doesn't mean it here, right? Cornuta here means a horn. Now, I want to show you that at least for the Americans or English speakers, I should say. I know that some people are from the UK, which I believe is an English-speaking country. So you may know the word cornucopia.
Yes.
Danny, you ever heard that word cornucopia before?
Sure. It's like a horned basket that holds your harvest in it.
Right. It's a basket that's shaped like a horn, which has your harvest in it. Now, the Latin cornucopia, copia is like the English word copious, a lot.
Horn of plenty.
So cornucopia means the horn of plenty. Cornucopia, the horn of plenty. It's the same word here, cornuta. Okay, so the Vulgate, the Latin translation of this verse is, he knew not that his face was horned, cornuta, it means a horn. Therefore, Michelangelo, presumably, based upon that verse, portrayed Moses with a horned face. There we go. Okay, now.
And just as a technical detail, when Jerome translated this, which is what Michelangelo is basing it on, although he's from Croatia, where was the translation actually made? What area?
Where was he sitting?
Yeah, I mean, was it like Jew-free, so to speak? So he had no Hebrew scholar to consult?
No, he definitely had Hebrew scholars to consult. As a matter of fact, guess where he died? Jerome. He died in Beit Lechem. He died in Efrat.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. So he definitely So now here's the thing. I'm going to say something. I don't want to ruffle too many feathers, but when I was a kid, this statue was always shown to us Jewish kids in Hebrew school to show you how these Christians, how they sometimes made such egregious errors in understanding the Torah. And Christianity is largely based upon erroneous translations of passages in the Tanakh. And we could feel this great sense of superiority and sort of laugh and mock at these Christians who don't know Hebrew and look at this stupid statue there. So I want to just say, as I'm getting older, not so fast, Kowalski. Not so fast, Kowalski. Okay? And I'd like to, this may sound a little strange, but I'd like to defend both our good friend Jerome, right, who created the Vulgate, and Michelangelo. First of all, let's bear in mind that, in fact, the meaning of the word Karen in all of Tanakh is a horn, with the exception of one ambiguous verse, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The word Karen means horn, with the possible exception of one verse in Habakkuk. We'll get to that in a minute. An only possible exception. That's number one. Number two, Jerome was a very prolific writer, and he wrote a commentary on the prophet Yechezkel, Ezekiel. Take a look at what Jerome says in his discussion of Ezekiel the prophet. This is translated from the Latin. And Moses ascended into the cloud and the mist, so that he could contemplate the mysteries of the Lord, which the people who were situated far off and remaining down below were not able to see. Then after 40 days, the multitude with their misted eyes were not able to see Moses' face, because it had been glorified, or as it is construed in the Hebrew, Moses' face was horned. So this is fascinating. So you see from Jerome, and I don't want to get into all the nuances of his comment here on Ezekiel, where he happened to discuss our story, in terms of Moses coming down with a horned face. But you see from here that Jerome doesn't seem to necessarily assume that Moses literally had horns. He says explicitly, Moses' face, because it had been glorified. This suggests, and then he quotes the Hebrew, saying that the word literally in Hebrew means horned, but it doesn't mean that Moses had horns. That the word literally means horned, except for it's a symbol of glory. It means Moses came down emitting a kind of glow of glory, of radiance of grandeur, something like that. So it's pretty clear that Jerome knew Hebrew, and his translation, cornuta, is because he was simply translating what the word means literally. But it's a metaphor. The horn is a metaphor for glory, as Jerome himself says in his comment on Ezekiel.
Rabbi?
Yes.
In graduate school, I was in Middle America with people who had never met Jews. These were down-home Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one in particular, a nurse, who wanted to palpate my forehead because she was convinced that Jews must have some remnants of horns, and she was quite surprised when she didn't find any. But that goes to shows how far it was that people today still believe this.
Yeah. So this happened to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The only thing I'm surprised about is that she didn't find the horns. Okay. Okay. So thank you for that. Okay. I mean, I know thousands of people watching this video, but I love Bruce, and part of my loving is we can sort of make fun, and he enjoys it. Okay.
Well, I had them surgically removed. It wasn't.
Okay, I understand. So did I. Okay. So now I want to go now into the related question, and that is, okay, so we've sort of defended Jerome, except for who's still on the hook, apparently?
Michelangelo.
So, what are we going to do about Michelangelo? Now, we could say that Michelangelo, he just portrayed Moses as the Vulgate literally describes him. It's just he didn't appreciate, Michelangelo that is, that Jerome was literally translating the word, but Jerome himself didn't understand it, that Moses had horns, but it's a metaphor for grandeur, glory, etc. So
Well,
that's not a defense of Michelangelo. That would make Michelangelo seem, not fully appreciated that particular biblical verse in accordance with the Vulgate. Yes.
well, beams of light may be hard to do in a sculpture.
Ah, okay. So that is now an alternative understanding that maybe even Michelangelo understood what Jerome meant. That it doesn't literally mean, it literally does mean horn, but a horn is a metaphor for light. Now, how do you portray that in a sculpture, right? This is not a hologram and you can make beams of light, right? It's made out of stone. How are you going to portray beams of light? Sort of sense of grandeur. So he put the horns that was supposed to be a kind of, I'm going to make up a word now, sculpturic metaphor. I just made that up. Sculpturic, right? And so it's a metaphor that was carved out of stone. Or else, as Bruce said, how's he supposed to portray this notion of sort of beams of light of expressing grandeur? Okay, so that's one possible explanation. There's another fascinating explanation by a rabbi and a lay scholar. So the Rabbi Benjamin Blech and Ray Doliner, who I happen to have met because my wife and I visited Rome a few years ago, and we consulted with Roy Dollinger, who I might have said Ray, it's Roy, who is the only Jewish certified Vatican tour guide. Okay, so he's a real expert on the Vatican and Rome in general. And in this book that they wrote called The Sistine Secrets, some of you may have read this book. It's a really fascinating book, Sistine Secrets. There's a claim that there are many things in the Sistine Chapel which are reflective of specifically a Jewish understanding of Tanakh. And that perhaps Michelangelo was very conversant with a Jewish understanding, and maybe in a subtle way was sort of protesting against the Catholic understanding of Tanakh by encrypting into his paintings symbols which seem to reflect Midrashic Jewish understandings of Tanakh as opposed to the Christian understanding of Tanakh. So if you're interested in the book, Sistine Secrets by Blech and Doliner. Okay, now, one of the suggestions that they make in this book is that Michelangelo, when he portrayed these horns, not only did he understand it does not mean horns, that Moses had horns. The word means horns, but it's a metaphor. And Michelangelo understood that. So you could say, like Bruce, that how else do you sculpt in something that would portray horns, rays of glory? But that's not what they say. They suggest that Michelangelo had in mind that this statue would be situated architecturally in the room where it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be part of a tomb. He was commissioned to make it for a tomb. And that there would be a window which would allow light to come in and then be refracted off of those protrusions coming from the head of Michelangelo, which would actually create the effect of rays of light. And you wouldn't actually see the protrusions, the physical protrusions from the head. You would actually just see beams of light as a function of light coming from the window and then being refracted from the sculpture from those two physical protrusions. He never meant it to be horns. He meant it to create this kind of visual effect of beams of light, which would be refracted from the light coming from the window and off the head. Now, A lot of scholars say this is ridiculous, but it's a fascinating speculation. Okay, so far so good. So this is probably the most famous representation of the word Karen, and we've defended Jerome and defended Michelangelo, perhaps. And now we're going to move on with a much less famous interpretation, but also considered to be extremely strange.
So, Rabbi,
Yeah.
you went from the Jerome, I think you said 4th century, to Michelangelo into the Renaissance.
Yeah.
Were there no intermediary phase of paintings or pictures in which they could have depicted beams?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, not only are there, but they do. We do have examples of Moses with horns artistically portrayed before Michelangelo. That's a good question. Yeah, I actually found, believe it or not, a master's thesis by somebody who was doing a thesis in art history, a Jew. And it's a very exhaustive analysis of this whole issue of this verse and how it was portrayed historically. If you're interested in that, I can send you a link. Okay, really interesting. Okay, let's now take a look at the Ibn Ezra. So the Ibn Ezra, which we're going to visit a lot in today and next week. So in the course of his discussion, he says the following, and I'm sorry I don't have an English translation of this, just in Hebrew, but I'll read it and translate it. And so the Ibn Ezra says the following right here. Yishtachu atzmot chivi haposhea. May the bones of the sinner, chivi, be ground to dust. You should know that Ibn Ezra was not a mild-mannered sweetheart. Ibn Ezra was a pretty tough guy. Would not want to meet up with him in a dark alley. Okay? So may the bones of Chivi, Haposhea, the criminal, the sinner, be ground to dust. Now, let's just pause here before we find out more about what he said, which so upset the Ibn Ezra. So Chivi Habalki is a 9th century Jewish heretic from Afghanistan. 9th century Jewish heretic from Afghanistan, who is quoted extensively by Rav Sadia Gaon and by the Ibn Ezra, and always to mock and ridicule him, which I guess is sort of success on the part of Chivi Habalki. You know, you get to remembered for posterity in the comments of Rav Sadia Gaon and the Ibn Ezra, even though the mentions of Chivi Habalki are usually very negative. Now, he's called Chivi Habalki, so Chivi is his name. Balki is a reference to the town in Afghanistan that he came from, Balak, was the name of the town. But he's often referenced by Rav Sadia Gaon and the Ibn Ezra, rather than calling him Chivi Habalki, if you take those same letters and reverse the order, Chivi HaKalbi, Balki Kalbi, and that means Chivi the dog. Chivi the dog. Okay? So, and I'm sure the Ibn Ezra would consider that to be an insult to Bruce's dog. They call it Chivi Habalki, Chivi HaKalbi. Now, what did this Chivi say in this particular case that was so worthy of ridicule? Let's read on. Sha'amar ki ba'avur shelo achal lechem shavu pnei Moshe yiveshot. Since Moshe, he didn't eat for 40 days, right? So since he didn't eat for so long, his face dried up, skin. He had a dermatological problem because of not eating for so long. Kmo hakeren, it became crusted over and hard, the skin of his face, like a horn. So Chivi Habalki understands the word keren to mean its usual meaning, a horn. But what would it mean that his face became horned? It's that from not eating for so long, the skin became hard. It's so dried out, like a horn is dry and hard. Vitam. Now, Chivia Balki was not stupid. He may have been a heretic, but he wasn't stupid. At least, I don't think he was so stupid. Rav Sanjigon and Ibn Ezra do think he was stupid. He says this explains a lot about the story. Why? Because what was the response when the people saw him coming down from the mountain? They ran away in fright. So now he goes on. Vitam v'yiru. Why does it say in the Torah that they were afraid and ran away? Mipnei shahayu panav mechorot. Because he was so awfully ugly. His face dried out and hard as a horn, as a result of not eating for so long, was so hideous. You know, people have dermatological problems. It's not pretty. They ran away because of how ugly he looked when he came down. Especially since people knew him from before. You know, they had a assumption of what he's supposed to look like, and now he comes back like a kind of science fiction creature from the Black Lagoon, monster, and they ran away.
He's definitely gaunt. He's at best deathly gaunt, but
yeah. So he must have been skinnier, I would assume. Now the Ibn Ezra comments in his usual kind and compassionate way about this understanding of what happened to Moshe's face. How could it be that this accursed one didn't open his eyes? A person is not afraid to approach another person. It's only when that person is somehow in a form which he has never seen before, right? So if you saw The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which I think was a movie I saw when I was 8 years old, which was a very frightening movie. Maybe somebody can, if anybody remembers that movie by that name, Creature of the Black Lagoon. In any case, like this is something unprecedented. So then you run away. So the Ibn Ezra says that cannot possibly be what happened with Moshe. So he explains. Let me just finish it. No, there's nobody who hasn't seen a dead person. I mean, right nowadays we're very hygienic about corpses, right? In pre-modern times, people knew what dead people looked like, right? There's nobody who hasn't seen a dead person. Velo yara megeshet elav, right? Nobody's afraid of a corpse. Everybody's seen a corpse, right? And a corpse looks kind of like, presumably, Moshe must have looked, according to Chivia Balki's explanation, like a corpse. V'od, furthermore, ilu hayakacha lama lo hayat tamid hamasve al panav. Furthermore, we know that Moshe, he didn't wear the veil all the time. If the reason that he covered up his face because he was so god-awful ugly, he should have continuously wore the veil. But it's clear from the Torah's description, he didn't continuously wear the veil. But if he was ugly, it should have been nonstop. Why, when he came with a revelation to share with the Jewish people, he would remove the veil? You would think it'd be the opposite. When he wants to convey God's word to the Jewish people, he wants them to listen to him, then he shouldn't be so frightening. He should wear the veil at that time, but that's not actually what the Torah says. The Torah says when he would convey the revelation, he would remove the veil. Furthermore, another reason why Chivi Habalti is an idiot, because we know the following, and Chivi Habalti should have known. The Torah says that when Moshe was 120 years old, okay, when he died, Lo kata einov lo naslecho. It says that his eyesight didn't diminish and the moisture didn't depart from him. Moisture. He looked like a model for Dead Sea Cosmetics. the very dermatological perfection of a human being. Torah says so. Balki didn't see that pasuk. Now wait a second. That's what he looked like when he's 120. Like a model off the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine. Perfect skin. This is not when he's 120, it's when he's 80. Can you imagine what Moshe's skin must have looked like then? It looked like the skin of a baby's bottom. Right? Beautiful. Kivya Balki is out to lunch according to Ibn Ezra. He's insane, doesn't know what he's talking about, and he's a heretic. Okay. So far, we've had two approaches, right? The approach of horns, maybe even literally. It's hard to know from Michelangelo's statue, which Romans, I don't think meant that. And we have Kivya Balki, who also says it means horns, but it means crusty, hard face. Fine. Now,
I mean, I joked with you earlier today, but
yeah,
if this was in today's lingo, we would say something like radiation effects, which does cause the skin to actually glow in some sense. Because
okay.
that's what this man is doing. He's trying to put a scientific rationale to what's going
Well,
on.
Bruce, you always do that, but look how the Ibn Ezra would describe you.
No, but with radiation, he might think that's very reasonable.
Kind of like a rational explanation. He doesn't want it. He just doesn't want it.
Yeah. So, by the way, it is interesting that Ibn Ezra was a rationalist, and I think that if he could have found a good rational explanation that fit all the facts, he wouldn't necessarily be opposed.
Right.
But the problem is that it doesn't fit any of the other elements of the story, right? Which he recounted, right? The fact that people don't run away from seeing a dry face, right? A corpse, even, right? That why did he remove the veil when he would teach Torah to the Jewish people? That wouldn't make any sense. And furthermore, the Torah says explicitly, even 40 years later, his skin was like the soft skin of a baby's bottom. So it just doesn't make sense contextually. Okay, so now I just want to point out, your question sort of leads us into the next issue, which is, so Bruce is suggesting that in modern Hebrew, the word Karen almost never means a horn. It means rays. You know, we go for all kinds of medical tests that use rays. We talk about the rays of the sun, Karnei Shemesh, etc. So it sort of flipped on its head. Like I mentioned before, there's not one verse in Tanakh that unambiguously means anything other than a horn. In modern Hebrew, there's almost no usage of the word Karen, which means a horn. It's almost always rays or a fund like Karen Kayemet, like a fund for money, etc. Okay. So where's this idea, which ironically Jews think is so obvious that it means raise? Where'd that come from? Because not obvious to me. Like I said, there's not one unambiguous verse in Tanakh which it means raise. Comes from Midrash. Let's take
what about Unkelus?
Uncle Lewis. So Uncle Lewis does understand as raise, because Uncle Lewis is representing the Talmudic understanding, which we're going to see the same Talmudic understanding, but in a Midrash. Okay, so let's take a look at this Midrash, Midrash Tanhuma, and I actually have that here in Hebrew and in English. Okay, so let's pull it up on the screen there. Just pull up the English there, like that. Okay, Midrash says the following. It quotes our pasuk Vayibered Moshe Har Sinai, right? It was, when Moshe came down from Har Sinai, Moshe didn't know that his face was Karan, whatever that means. Minayin zacha Moshe lekarnei ahod. From where did Moshe merit these karnei hahod? Right away, the Midrash says that we're not talking about the horns of a wild ox. It says horns of glory. So apparently, The word Karen here, it's not 100% clear that they mean light yet, but if it means a horn, it only in a metaphorical sense, which represents glory. By the way, it's interesting. If you say it means horn literally, but it's a metaphor for glory, have we seen anybody else who said that so far?
Well, Jerome.
Jerome. Okay. So
Uncle Jerry.
Thank you. Along with Uncle Lewis, right? We have a lot of distinguished people here. So the Midrash Tanhuma and Uncle Jerry and Unclus, which we haven't quoted, but thanks for mentioning him. He also understands it like this. Let's go on. Our sages said the following. So where did it come from? How do you merit those? Min hama'ara, from the cave. What's that about? Shnemar. V'haya ba'avor kvodi v'samticha b'dikrat hatzur. So the Midrash here quotes from the same Torah portion. This is the whole mysterious episode of the sin of the golden calf, Moshe's attempt at seeking forgiveness from God. And in the description of that incident, there's this mystical description of an encounter between God and Moshe. And in that particular description, Moshe is placed in a kind of a cave or a crack in the rock. And the Torah describes that the glory of God is going to pass by him. Okay, now, what went on there? So let's read on. Natan HaKadosh Baruch Hu kaf yado alav. What happened when God passed in front of Moshe? Moshe is like concealed, hiding in this cave in the rock. Midrash says that, that God placed his hand upon him. God placed his own hand upon him. Don't ask me about God having a hand. Umisham zachal karnei ahod. That's where these karnei ahod, horns of glory, rays of glory, come from. V'cheinu omer. Now, how do we know this? Now, remember I told you that there's not one unambiguous verse which translates the word Karen in the sense of a ray. So I use the word unambiguous carefully. There's one verse in all of Tanakh in which the word Karen might mean something other than a horn. What's that verse? It's the verse quoted by the Midrash here. So the verse in the prophet Habakkuk says the following. Karnaim miyado lo, v'sham chevyon uzo. So that particular verse is a hard verse, and we'll translate it in a way that the Midrash understands it. Rays hath he at his side, and there is the hiding of his power. That's the verse. It's describing God conquering the Babylonians. And it describes him in these very mysterious and metaphorical ways. Rays hath he at his side, and there is the hiding of his power. Now, in order to appreciate the Midrash here, you have to look at the verse more literally, because when it's translated, rays hath he at his side, the Hebrew doesn't say at his side. The Hebrew says, Karnaim miyado lo. Karnaim miyado lo. And Danny Chesterman, what does miyado lo mean? Karnaim miyado lo. Miyado lo.
From his hands.
From his hand. There are karnaim from his hand, lo, to him. Now that's understood as that God is portrayed here as rays coming out of God. But it's understood by the Midrash. Remember, the Midrash said, where'd the rays come from? It said that when Moses was hid in the rock, that God put his hand on Moses, and that's where the rays came from. And then it points to this verse, Karnaim miyado lo, that there are Karnaim from his hand, God's hand, lo, to him, with not capital H, to him, Moses. That verse in Habakkuk is describing God putting his hand on Moses' head, and that's where the Karnaim came from. Karnaim from God's hand to him, to Moses. Everybody got that? That's the Midrashic understanding of that particular verse. Now we're going to return to that verse, because this is the only verse in which Karnaim may not be horns, because after all, in that verse, it's hard to understand that as being a horn, right? Horns from his hand to him, what would that mean? Furthermore, we often find the word Karnaim used in the what's called smichut, karnei re'em, horns of a wild ox. So you can see that the word Karen or Karnaim means a horn, because it specifically references it to an animal, karnei re'em, horns of wild ox. Here, the word Karnaim appears by itself without any reference to an animal. So Karnaim miyado lo, that Karnaim, whatever that means, from his hand to him, v'sham chevyonu zo, there is the hiding of his power, also mysterious phrase, but not so important for our purposes today, right? So that verse, the word Karnaim may not necessarily mean something to do with an animal, but rather something that was coming out of Moshe's head, like rays. Okay?
Well, just to reference this, mythologically speaking, all the societies had something like storm gods who could shoot out rays, but they, Zeus or Poseidon, but they used the word like more of a chashmal, but they had an ability, a power to shoot out these rays that made them powerful.
Yeah, okay. So metaphorically, one can understand, and perhaps even a cultural universal, that somehow rays of light represent power. And the source of that would certainly be, when we think about the natural world, what is the thing that we experience, which is very evocative of power? The sun. The sun is probably the most impressive natural phenomenon that we experience. So therefore, this notion of rays of light is an apt metaphor for power, for grandeur, etc. Okay, it makes a lot of sense. Now, I just want to, because we don't have too much time, let me able to just read the rest of this Midrash in English.
By the way, where do you find this, the idea that this is the sole reference in Habakkuk?
Yeah. So how do I know that it's the only place?
I'm just curious about how you found it.
Yeah. Okay. So now I'm not sure what you're asking. So are you asking, how do I know it's the only reference, or how did I know about Habakkuk?
Both.
Okay. Okay.
Tell us the story behind the story.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, it's the way I prepare every shiur. You look at one thing which leads you to another, which leads you to another thing. So, I started with the pasuk, obviously, right? And then I start looking at the medieval commentaries, right? Usually start with Rashi, right? And then Rashi is usually based upon a Talmudic source. So I look up the Talmudic source, or Midrash, right? And that's how it goes. So I easily, because Rashi's quoting Tanhuma, you'll see. Rashi quotes the Tanhuma.
So the reason and I'll tell you my reason for asking is I found the website of the Academy of Hebrew, the official government Academy of Hebrew Language, for an explanation of Keren Or. Why do we use the expression in modern Hebrew of beam of light? Where does it come from?
Yeah.
And they say on the official website of the Academia LeLashon that Habakkuk is the only source for this.
Right. And by the way, I saw that too, and I'm actually a subscriber.
Okay.
To that. Right. Yeah. So, but it's not that hard, because, like I said, Rashi right away is referencing the Tanhuma. Okay. So this is the rabbinic source. Now you'll see that this is not at all crazy, but that maybe it does mean something about like rays of light, but you'll see also not necessarily. That's why I said there's no unambiguous source in Tanakh. And by the way, even if this verse did mean rays of light, that's pretty incredible that the word Karen is not a rare word in Tanakh. would every single other time mean a horn, and only one time means something else? That's pretty remarkable. Okay, so let's just read quickly the rest of the Midrash. We're going to return next week to some of this Midrash, but I just want to get through it because I want to talk about that verse in Habakkuk for a few minutes before we have to end. So just to finish off the Midrash, so where did the rays of light come from? So the first thing is that from God's hand, as we see in Habakkuk, right? That the Karnaim, rays of light, came from God's hand, and he gave them over to Moshe. There are others who say that at the time the Holy and Blessed be He taught him the Torah, sparks emanated from the countenance of the Shekhinah, and he, Moshe, received the beams of glory from them. Another suggestion, Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Nachman, said the tablets, right, 10 Commandment tablets, were 6 handbreadths long and 3 handbreadths thick. And Moses held them by 2 of the handbreadths, and the Holy and Blessed be He held them by 2. So God's got one end, Moses got the other. And Moses obtained the beams of glory from the 2 handbreadths in the middle. Anybody who can tell me what that midrash means, you win a big prize, and I'd be much appreciative.
Yeah, the energy from God drifted down into the stone, and Moshe absorbed them literally from God.
Okay, so that sounds a lot like the previous explanation, right? That there were sparks that came from the Shekhinah, and he absorbed them. So this is a little different because it's specifically tying it into the 10 Commandments, but specifically the middle 2 handbreadths, right? There's 6 handbreadths. So God has 2, Moses has 2, and the sparks came from the middle. So whatever that means. So interesting image, and you could think about it and report back. Let's finish it off. Rabbi Shmuel said, after Moses wrote the Torah, a little ink was left in the pen. And when he passed it before his head, the beams of glory were formed upon it, as it is said, and Moses knew not that the skin of his face sent forth beams. It came from the leftover ink in Moses' pen. This part of the Midrash, I have an amazing interpretation of, which we'll share at the very end of our analysis. And the final suggestion, all the glory he obtained was a reward for what he had done. But you, God, place the beams, as it is said, raise hath he at his side. That's that verse from Habakkuk. And there is the hiding of his power. The righteous receive their reward in the world to come, but he, Moses, received his reward even then, at that time. He didn't have to wait for the world to come. As it is said, behold, the Lord will come as a mighty one, and his arms will rule for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. Okay, fine. Well, now in our final minutes, I want to dig into this alleged single verse in Tanakh, which Tanhuma claims the word karnaim means raise. It doesn't mean a horn. It means raise. So here's our verse, Habakkuk. V'noga ka'or tiyeh, and there was brightness like the light emanating from God. Karnaim miadolo, he had rays from his hand, karnaim rays. V'sham chevyonuzo, and there was his strength hidden. That's our verse. Now, what does the word karnaim mean there? Ibn Ezra, and I think we're just going to expedite this by doing this in English. The word Karen, now here's the Ibn Ezra actually on our verse in describing Moses. But he says right away, you can't understand it without Habakkuk. The word Karen, it is like the verse in Habakkuk. He had raised from his hand. Now, what makes us think that the word karnaim means raise? This is a very important linguistic point he's making here. Since it is written in Habakkuk, and there was a brightness like the light, that's the first part of the verse, v'noga ka'or tiyeh. There was brightness like the light, and then it goes on, he had raised from his hand. That's the second part of the verse. Ibn Ezra comments, the verse is using a doubled expression. Now, ready for this? The outstanding feature of biblical poetry is to say the same thing twice using slightly different words. That's called parallelism. If you see, like Tehillim all the time, this type of device, poetic device, it says something which conceptually is essentially the same, but using different words. Okay? So the Ibn Ezra looks at that verse and he has very fine literary poetic skills. He's a poet. And it says in Habakkuk, the Noga Kaortia, and the brightness, Noga, by the way, it's the name of a star, which is very bright. You know what Noga is? What star? Venus, right? Because bright star. Noga Kaortia, and the brightness was like a light, Kaor. Now it's going to repeat that reference of light shining, but using different words. Karnaim miadolo. Karnaim is parallel to the word or. Kaor, karnaim. That's the poetic structure. So that's what the Ibn Ezra is pointing out. The way we know what the word karnaim means is to look at the poetic structure. What is the parallel word in the first phrase of that verse? Karnaim is parallel to or. Or means light. Karnaim means rays of light. Voila, Habakkuk. It's the source of Karnaim as rays of light, as opposed to all the other circumstances of that word in Tanakh, where it means a horn. And then even it says, now we have two examples, because the Karnei or Pnei Moshe, the rays coming from the light of Moshe. So that's the other reference. So now, based upon Habakkuk's resolution of Karnaim as or, we now can understand Moshe's face, which was radiating light. So we would have, at the end of the day, two. Now, the Academy for the Hebrew Language didn't cite the verse from Moshe, because no one knows what it means. But in Habakkuk, because of the parallel structure of or and Karnaim, there it's a more compelling explanation. So now, just quickly, let's take a look at how Rashi understands that verse in Habakkuk. So Rashi says, the expression of a light, which when piercing and shining through a hole, appears like protruding horns. Similarly, and he quotes Moshe, our case, for the skin of his face shone. So Rashi is like the Ibn Ezra, but actually says, why does the word Karen or Karnaim mean a ray of light? So he says it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that the same three consonants, Kuf Resh Nun, can mean a horn or a ray of light. It's because light coming through a protrusion.
Listen, Shira, can I call you back? We're on Cola.
Yeah, Bruce, you're on. You're being. Everybody can hear you.
Ah.
Let's see here. Hi, Bruce.
What?
Bruce, make sure you mute yourself. Thank you. Okay, so the Rashi on Habakkuk points out that it means light, right? But it can look like a horn, right? When the light is going through a gap, right? Piercing and shining through a hole, then it can look like an animal's horns. So it does mean a ray of light here. It just happens to use the same word because its shape looks something like the shape of light protruding through holes. Now I want to show you. Remember I said there's not one unambiguous use of the term Karnaim, which means ray of light? Mitzudat Tzion on Habakkuk says it doesn't mean ray of light. He says that when it says Karnaim there in that verse in Habakkuk, it means horns, not ray of light. And he explains why does he use the word horn? Because this is a metaphor for sovereignty and strength, as a horned animal is strengthened by them. So when it says Karnaim yado lo, Karnaim, whatever that means, from his hand to him, it means a horn, but it's a metaphor for sovereignty and strength, because an animal, right? The animal has a horn, very strong and powerful. So you see that verse, even that one verse in Habakkuk, the word Karnaim just may mean horn, and it's a symbol for strength. It does not mean a ray. It does not mean a ray of light, according to Mitzudat Tzion. So we don't even have one unambiguous example of the word Karen or Karnaim meaning a ray of light, but that verse in Habakkuk is understood by many to mean a ray of light, not a horn. And it's just that, since the light can look like a horn of an animal, Hebrew uses the same word to portray a ray of light. I just want to show you now. Let's just take a look at Rashi. So Rashi says that the skin of his face beamed. Karan is an expression connected with the word karnaim, horns. And the phrase Karen or, the light horned, is used here because light radiates from a point and projects like a horn. It's the same thing he said in Habakkuk. It can look like a horn, the light, and that's why we use the same word, but it definitely does not mean horn. It's not horn as a metaphor for power, right? It means a ray of light. And then Rashi quotes the Tanhuma, right? And whence was Moses privileged to have the rays of glory? Our rabbi said that they originated at the time that he was in the cave. For the holy and blessed be he, then put his hand upon his face, as it is said, blah, 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 which we saw the original Tanhuma before. So that's by looking at Rashi, then we get to the Tanhuma, but that verse is ambiguous. It could mean what the Mitzudat Zion said. It actually means horn, and it's a metaphor for strength. And so that leaves us, in terms of Moshe, what was coming out of his head, it far from clear, right? It may mean that grandeur, strength, and it uses the word horn, which means horn. Karen, it means horn, but it's a metaphor for strength. Or it may be that the same word Karen can mean light, which is the way it's commonly understood in, I say, the majority opinion here. And the reason that the same word can mean light is because light can have the form, like Rashi explains, of the shape of a horn. With that, we're going to pause, and we will continue Bezrat Hashem next week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Just a quick comment. All the mythological gods wore horned helmets, and perhaps we're trying to get away from that imagery by moving into a more spiritual of light.
So Bruce is saying that the rabbinic tendency to not want to interpret it literally as a horn, but rather it means something totally different. It means a ray of light, based upon a possible interpretation of Habakkuk, was motivated by a desire to distance from this kind of mythological pagan notion of gods having these horns. Interesting speculation. Okay, we will continue Bezrat Hashem next week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.